Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. So now, Consuelo.
Hi, everyone. I'm very honored to be here and sharing this moment with you all. Let's conquer the world, said Jim to me once, with a touch of irony and provocation. At that time, we were writing a book in Portuguese with a Costa Rican and Brazilian colleague in order to present Jim's work to the Portuguese-speaking community. That book never saw the light of day, but it was one of the many bridges that Jim wanted to create to connect North American and Latin American organizational communication scholarship. It probably all started with Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela's theory of autopoiesis. Jim's interest in the work of these Chilean biologists led him to search for and discover new ways of conceptualizing organizational communication beyond the then dominant communication in organization paradigm. As Jim mentioned in 2013 in a chapter entitled Organizational Communication at the Crossroads, and I quote, "I built my argument around Maturana and Varela's concept of autopoiesis, a theory that treats the cell as a closed, self-reproductive system. I took from the notion of autopoiesis the principle that human communication as a society must be also, in its way, reflexively self-reproducing." End of quote. A central principle emerging from this work is what Jim called the autonomy of communication. That is, its reflexive organizing properties and its capacity to generate organization. As Jim put it in 1995, and I quote again, "Conversation is thus autopoietic just in the sense that Maturana and Varela specify. It literally produces itself, and since, I think, organization is conversation, organization produces itself, it is operationally closed." End of quote. To put it simply, organization cannot be understood without communication and vice versa. Here, we see what Ruth Smith called the equivalency approach and what Gail and Linda called the grounded in action orientation. Both have been used to describe Jim's work and that of the Montreal school that Jim founded. I'd like to think that this first Chilean connection had something to do with Jim's genuine interest in my own work. As any Chilean student in communication, I had read Maturana and Varela, as well as their colleague Fernando Flores, whose work on management and cognition Jim particularly appreciated. I remember one of our first conversations in the hallway of the communication department at the Université de Montréal. Jim was very curious about my interpretation of the Tree of Knowledge, one of Maturana and Varela's seminal book. I was so amazed that he knew the book first and had read it in Spanish. Early on in that conversation, I realized that he was the one teaching me in a renewed way what I had learned during my undergrad studies. This sincere curiosity and willingness to deeply grasp other worldviews, as he'd like to call them, always with respect and care, would continue to amaze me over the years. Let me give you another example. For those who have read Jim and Elizabeth book, The Situated Organization, you may recall that one of the chapters is based on my dissertation research of Explora, a Chilean outreach organization. The concept of space was central in my thesis, and therefore the geographical features of Chile were key to understanding Explora's communicative constitution. This is how Elizabeth and Jim opened the chapter, and I quote, "Chile is a fascinating country, with the towering Andes to the east and the mighty Pacific Ocean to the west. It is squeezed into an elongated band of territory, stretched out over some 6,500 kilometers, from north to south, from Arica to Punta Arenas, Chileans like to say. It's one of the longest countries in the world, if not the longest. At its Peruvian extension to the north, it turns into a blistering desert. At its other extremity, it is the last stop before the South Pole. Punta Arenas is located near the Strait of Magellan, where in the age of sail, a sailor once allowed himself to breathe again after routing Cape Horn. End of quote. This is the most precise and poetic description of my country I have ever read. Jim extended the signs of respect and admiration toward other Latin American students and professors, Adriana Casali and Marlene Marchori from Brazil, Lisette Marroquin from Costa Rica, to name a few. He and Elizabeth chose Brazil and Costa Rica to write their 2011 and 2014 books. I'm sure the Brazilian abacaxi, the pineapples, and the Costa Rican mangoes nurtured their bodies and minds well and helped them create these masterpieces. Jim and Elizabeth also learned both Portuguese and Spanish, or rather a mix, what we call Portuñol, language they believed was not only a way to communicate with us, but also to comprehend our languaging, another term Jim borrowed from Maturana. I'm not sure if we conquered the world. However, Latin America surely did conquer Jim and Elizabeth's hearts. Through its hybridation with North American and European thinking, it informed a vital part of the inspirational worldview they shared with us all. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really sorry not to be able to be there with you, but I'm honored to have the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I had the good fortune many years ago being head of the Management Communication Department at the University of Waikato in Hamilton and needing to find someone to teach a summer school course for 2001. Summer is January and February in this part of the world. Since moving to New Zealand in 1996, one of my goals was to put communication studies in New Zealand on the map, in part by bringing in prominent scholars for short-term stints so that my Waikato colleagues could benefit from them, and so the visitors could become ambassadors for our program. It was a wonderful time, and we enjoyed visits from Steve May, George Cheney, Cynthia and Michael Stoll, Sally Planalp, Connie Bullis, and of course, Jim and Elizabeth, and many others. Many fruitful collaborations came out of those visits. Sometime in mid-2000, I sent a notice on the ICA OrgCom listserv that we all used at the time about the need for someone to teach a summer school course. And Jim responded. And I was, of course, thrilled with the prospect of Jim and Elizabeth visiting us in Hamilton. We quickly agreed that he would teach a special topics course with a focus on the computerization of work. I went back through some of my old files in planning for this panel, and I found a letter I wrote to the New Zealand Immigration Office in trying to fast track their visa application. And I wrote, Dr. James Taylor possesses unique expertise in this area, having recently published the book, The Computerization of Work, which will serve as the primary required textbook for the course, and having a long and distinguished record of organizational communication scholarship. Dr. Taylor offers our department a short-term solution to our current staff shortage problem. In addition, he will add to the international flavor of our program and enrich the department during his short visit with us. For example, his expertise will be incorporated into the design of our planned offerings in communication and e-commerce. Sounds very strange and almost funny to me to think that I framed Jim's visit as just a solution to a staffing shortage, but there you go. We decided that Jim's teaching assistant for the course would be Debbie Page, who was my doctoral student at the time. And in preparing for the course, Debbie sent along to Jim a newspaper clipping about a front page item in the New Zealand News at the time that she thought might interest him: the New Zealand police's problems in adopting and implementing their, quote, integrated crime information system, end quote, or what they called INSIS. Debbie's instincts were right, and Jim began an extensive investigation into the people and processes involved in what can only be described as a large-scale debacle. INSIS was, and still remains to this day, the largest software engineering project ever funded by the New Zealand government. It ended up costing over $110 million and led to a ministerial inquiry into what went wrong. After the initial visit in early 2001, Jim and Elizabeth came back to New Zealand every summer for several years. Each time, he dug a bit deeper into INSIS, and he and Elizabeth continued to mull over what to do with the case. During their many visits in the process of a tennis match. We were all a bit younger back then, or at a department gathering or meeting for a beer. I asked occasionally how things were going with the INSIS case. I tried not to be pushy, but I was really excited about the thought of Jim Taylor's next masterpiece being focused on New Zealand. I only got snippets of information, which basically amounted to, we're still digging into it. But at some point, I started to wonder if they decided not to publish the case at all, because several years had passed and nothing had been written that I knew of about the INSIS case. But of course, Jim was retired already at that stage, and they were in no rush. Sometime during one of their summer visits several years later, I'm guessing around 2005, Jim and Elizabeth invited me over for lunch at the place they were renting in Hamilton. He told me they wanted to talk to me about what they were thinking regarding the INSIS case. So I was excited about that. After a nice lunch and a beer, I noticed Jim and Elizabeth often had a beer with lunch, a tradition that I thought was really decadent, but I never objected when they offered me one. Anyway, after the lunch and beer, we pushed back from the table and Jim started talking to me about authors, authoring, and authority. I have to admit, I sometimes was really challenged to follow Jim's train of thought. That's because of my deficiencies, not his. So it took me a little while to see what all this had to do with INSIS. But in his usual way, Jim drew on a wide variety of sources and traditions and went about providing an intricate explanation of what was at that time only in its infancy, but I could see the beginnings of the theoretical framework that he would use to explain the breakdowns of authority that led to the INSIS debacle. And 13 years after his initial interviews, INSIS ended up as one of the 2 case studies that were the basis for their book, When Organization Fails, Why Authority Matters. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Jim and Elizabeth and have played a very small part in their work. But more than that, I will cherish the memories of their visits to New Zealand and the kindness, generosity, and sense of humor that for a number of years gave us one more reason to look forward to summer. Thanks.
Hi everybody, and welcome to my home office in Denmark. I'm grateful to Francois for giving me this opportunity to participate in the celebration of James Taylor and his work, even though I can't make it to ICA this year. I can't recall exactly when I was exposed to his work, but approximately 20 years ago, I had the great pleasure of hosting Jim and Elizabeth for a PhD course that I hosted at my former university. As you can tell, it's quite some years ago in my case. At this course, participants had to read this wonderful book, as well as one of my all-time favorites, this piece by Francois and James from 1997. As you all know, I mean, both these texts are extremely sophisticated, as are all Jim's texts, really, filled with sophisticated ideas and insights. Coming from a sociological background, I especially appreciate the fact that although these books and texts focus on how organizations emerge in text and conversations, society keeps shining through. A few years later, when I became interested in corporate social responsibility, I realized that I had to return to the text, because there was so much more there that needed to be brought into other fields as well. In the particular arena of corporate social responsibility, there's generally a very suspicious attitudes toward communication. Communication is superficial, deception, and stuff like that. Most CSR communication is met with contempt, lack of trust, so to speak, even from scholars who officially subscribe to a performance perspective on communication. Notions such as greenwashing, window dressing, insincerity, deception, hypocrisy, and bullshit are all over the place, and it's not difficult to sympathize with these descriptions given the many cases of fraud and deception we see in the corporate landscape. The whole idea that there's something underneath the surface that does not match the surface is very, very important here. And the call and the persistent call for consistency between front stage or backstage, or between what organizations claim about themselves and what they actually do, is of course very, very important. However, when this becomes an idea that organization cannot be allowed to articulate standards, values about responsibility and sustainability unless they already 24/7 are able to live up to these practices, to these claims, if that's the idea, then the whole idea of communicative performativity is essentially rejected. Communication becomes something of much lesser value, so to speak. It might be the case, as a Chinese proverb says, that talk doesn't cook rice. However, most of the rice in the world would never, ever reach a kitchen without a lot of talk. So this points into, a temporal perspective. There's something before and something after, and in fact, you can't really distinguish talk and action here. Together with Mette Morsing and Ole Thyssen, I coined in a piece 10 years ago the notion of aspirational talk. The notion tried to describe specific type of communication whose constitutive potential extended into an unknown future, an uncertain future, so to speak. If aspirational talk is defined this way, as self-descriptions to which practices cannot live up, it's easy to see the greenwashing or other types of hypocrisy at play. But as soon as we add current practices cannot yet live up, there's a potential and an idea that something might happen over time, provided the right circumstances are there, so to speak. So there is perhaps a constitutive potential here. One example of aspirational talk, for example, is the ambition of the Copenhagen municipality to be carbon neutral in 2025. Copenhagen is not going to make it. It's certainly not in 2025. But I'm interested in under what circumstance, under which condition can that potentially happen? If not in 25, then in 30 or in some other year. What we know for sure that this ambition has set in motion a lot of initiatives that could not, and probably not, would not have happened unless the municipality made a number of rather bold sustainability claims. So under what conditions should we expect that type of talk, that type of ambitions to actually unfold into further activities, further sustainability activities on the part of organizations? Certainly there needs to be some dependency of social recognition. It needs to sort of happen in a public space where the organization risks being challenged. Stakeholder attention. And perhaps there also needs to be inconsistency. Perhaps if no inconsistencies were detected, perhaps then nobody would notice it. Nobody would hold the organization, the speaker or whatever, or the politician to its words. Okay. So maybe perceived inconsistency and even a pressure for alignment, maybe these are some of the components necessary to be present in order for that type of talk to really perform. A number of recent studies suggest that CSR aspiration can do something, at least have potential to attract stakeholder attention, stimulate critique, motivate organizations to at least try to accomplish their CSR goals. Channel perceptions in CSR directions, or mobilize internal activists to demand specification, follow up activities, etc. Raise collective expectation, define a new horizons of ideals and standards and stuff like that. Whether these potential is enough to generate a sustained focus on responsibilities, of course, and other questions, and it's empirical question, of course. And it remains a highly contested question. But perhaps interestingly, the sustained suspicion may be one of the important felicity conditions for actually that type of talk to constitute organizations. There is, of course, a perpetual risk of misfire. Decoupling has been mentioned in literature, overbidding, aspirational inflation, apathy, cynicism, and many other things that tells us it may not quite perform as intended or as allegedly intended anyway. Okay. On the other hand, performativity is not an automatism. The constitution of organization is not an automatism. As McKinley says, it makes no sense to describe something as performative unless it can fail. And as Butler has stressed in many of her works, communicative constitution is unstable. And it takes place through numerous iterations, contestation, variations. And this is something that goes across organizations, that invites or includes many different voices from many different corners that step in and interact and participate in articulating what this means. While Butler's focus has been especially on gender, her ideas are so very well applicable to this particular context as well. What now? We will all be missing Jim Taylor. The torch has already been passed on to a group of extremely qualified, interesting, inspiring scholars whose work I always enjoy reading and that I cite again and again and again. So there's lots of room for optimism here in this particular arena here. I would, though, since we're gathered here to celebrate Jim's work, I would encourage younger CCO scholars to revisit his works, to discover, perhaps rediscover how communicative constitution, extends beyond individual speech acts, beyond the situation. It stretches in temporality to discover how it also extends beyond formal organizational boundaries and potentially includes many other organizations that together constitute new values about responsibility, sustainability, difference and variety and diversity and stuff like that. But also how beyond the ideas, values and authorities that are not explicitly invoked in specific speech situations, so to speak. I mean, the ability of organization and other social actors to actually look at themselves by imagining how others perceive them is something I believe needs to be brought into the field and which has already in many, many different ways been indicated or even spelled out in the works of James Taylor. Thanks for your attention.
So Gina.
Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned earlier by Francois, so I have a more personal recollection and sharing this afternoon. Can I show that?
Yep.
This? Sorry. So I was assigned by Francois with this title, James' Collaborative Spirit. I don't know whether you can read it from the perspective of an Asian academic. It is unusual for a student working on a dissertation to be treated like an equal by a seasoned scholar like Jim, much less to be invited by him to afterwards as the co-author of a book chapter. Jim's collaborative spirit pervaded our professional relationships since 1999, when I first approached him via email for guidance on my dissertation that I was working at the University of Putra, Malaysia. I'm from the Philippines, but I was studying in Malaysia. Upon encountering his book, Rethinking the Theory of Organizational Communication, my dissertation was on communication as constitutive of temporary organization, particularly research collaborative networks. He directed me to other papers written by him and the emerging Montreal School, through which I was able to complete my dissertation in 2004. I classified Jim's collaborative spirit into three: as a co-author, as a colleague, and as a co-organizer. First, as a co-author, I shared with Jim a copy of my dissertation as a way of thanking him for his mentoring role, particularly on organization as a construction of text made out of conversation and the equivalency of communication and organization, and of the narrative structure and organization. It was a pleasant surprise when he emailed back that the dissertation fits beautifully in the book they were putting together. You can see that. Oh, no, this one. Yes, this one. Communication is organizing empirical and theoretical exploration in the dynamic of text and conversation, published in 2006. With a feeling of inadequacy on my part, we co-authored the books Chapter 3, The Structuring of Collaborative Research Networks in the Stories Researchers tell. Second, as a colleague, through the years, he would email me like an equal, which I did expect, as I said, from an Asian perspective. I may read some of these emails. The one that was sent to me in 2010, send me your stuff when you can, Jean. I'll be interested to hear more. In 2012, hi Jean, I finally found a minute to read your papers. It's been busy, very nice work, and truly interesting what you do with some of our ideas. I'd like to circulate your chapter to a few people. Could you send me the full reference? And thanks for keeping me in touch with the work you are doing. It's very constructive, Jean. And in 2012, he also emailed me, hi Jean, I'm writing you for a favor. Our 2000 book, The Emergent Organization, is being submitted for the 2013 ICA Fellows Book Prize in London. Will you be there? Would you feel comfortable writing a letter of support? I think of you because you can attest to the fact that the book has had an influence beyond North America. You have continued to work in the field, so you can say something about how the book has been a stimulus to your own research. If you do feel comfortable doing this, and only if you do, the letter of support should go to Boris. And maybe we wish you a happy holiday. So, of course, I feel honored with that request. Again feeling inadequate. As a co-organizer, as a co-organizer for an ICA panel in 2013, earlier than the last email that I read, I emailed him just to ask if he would be organizing a panel at ICA, and if I could be part of it. He, with Francois, suggested that I could be the lead organizer, which again, I felt I was inadequate to do so. But of course, I organized the panel. But before the ICA started, he sent this email on 22nd of April 2013. This is just a brief note, Jean, to let you know so you can make other arrangements, that medical problems are going to make it impossible for Elizabeth and myself to be in London ICA. We are truly sorry. We were so looking forward to seeing all our friends. The prospects, we are told, are good for a full recovery, but in the meantime, travel is out, certainly this spring. And I replied, so sad to hear that, Jim, been looking forward for our meeting. but I understand I should find a way to visit you and Elizabeth in Montreal, praying for your quick recovery. In 2018, the opportunity to meet him in person, him and Elizabeth in person, presented itself when I attended a conference in Montreal. That photo was the first and the final face-to-face meeting with him. 2 years later, in 2020, he replied to my email where I shared the photos taken at their residence in Montreal. Jean, wishing you the best of the season and a better year ahead. Thank you for the photo. Goes back a bit. Thanks, Jean, for your collaborative spirit, professionally and personally.